Welcome to the Cuban Museum. My name is Carmen Valdivia, the museum's director. I hope that you have had a chance to visit our Operation Pedro Pan exhibit downstairs, and if you have not, I hope and I encourage you to do it. We're very proud of our exhibit, and unfortunately, on March 24th of 2022, it will be the last day to view it. It gives me great pleasure to introduce one of our own, one of our Pedro Pan brothers. Our family is over 14,000 strong, and our lives have a common thread. Most of us were born in Cuba in the late 40s or early 50s. We left Cuba without our parents between December of 1960 and October of 1962. We endured La Pecera at Havana's Rancho Boyeros Airport, yet each one of us has a unique story to tell. Today we will hear one of those unique stories, the individual story of a Black Pedro Pan. Today's author was born in Cuba in 1949. He came from Cuba through Operation Pedro Pan in 1962. On my copy of his book, he wrote, "To a fellow traveler in a magical voyage that set the course of our lives. Like myself, he was one of those, the last ones to arrive. Por poco nos quedamos en Cuba. Because I arrived in August and he arrived in September of 1962. Operation Pedro Pan ended in October 22nd of 1962. It scares me when I ponder on how different our lives would have been had our flights been scheduled for October or early November. The advantage of having arrived at the tail end of the operation was that there were no urgency for resettlement and we could stay in the camps for longer periods of time. The Florida City camp, the place that we both called home, was a special place. There were wonderful lessons learned at the camp. We were white, we were black, we were Chinese, we had black hair, blonde hair, and red hair. But we bonded in a colorblind kind of way that would have fulfilled Martin Luther King's dream. We were one for all and all for one. Our adversity was our only enemy, and we were going to conquer it each on our own way. Toward the end of his book, our author talks about Martí's dream of a Zorro in Cuba, con todos y para el bien de todos. And then he asks, so, am I black or am I Cuban? I am both. I can assure you, I am, after all, a Black Pedro Pan. And I say, Ricardo, you're one of us. Ladies and gentlemen, Ricardo Gonzalez Zayas.
Good evening. Wow. Hi. It is my great pleasure to share this evening with you in this facility which is so emblematic of the Cuban exile experience. I would like to thank Carmen and the staff of the American Museum of the Cuban Diaspora for making this evening possible. I'm pleased to see so many familiar faces, especially those who shared the Pedro Pan experience with me. Thank you all for being here. Before I start, I'd like to pay tribute to my parents. Almost 60 years ago, they sent their black 13-year-old only child to an uncertain destination, an uncertain future, hoping that he would have a better life. I lost him long ago. But I can somehow feel their presence here today. For those of you not familiar with Operation Pedro Pan, it was a program conceived shortly after the 1959 revolution, facilitated by the Catholic Welfare Bureau. Unaccompanied minors, ages 6 to 18, were provided entry visas into the United States where they could stay until they could reunite with their parents. Their parents not being able to leave the island or not wanting to leave the island at the time. Some 14,000 children availed themselves of these visas, but according to another Pedro Pan who did the study, About half of them, when they arrived, were received by a family member or a relative from before, that they knew before, and they went to live with them. The other half, including myself, were the folks that shared the unique experience, the unique Pedro Pan experience, in my view. Tonight, I will read a few paragraphs from my book and add a few comments to give these paragraphs context. I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of my presentation. I will begin by quoting Toni Morrison, one of my favorite writers. She said, "If there is a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it." So I did. The following excerpt from the book captures the essence of what I'm trying to convey. It is the essence of the book that I always wanted to read, but hadn't been written yet. Any glasses?
Don't feel bad. You're not the only one.
During the early years of the Cuban Revolution, few Black Cubans fled the island via the Pedro Pan program or by any other means. At times, considered too Black to be Cuban and or too Cuban to be Black, their life journey in their new, often hostile surroundings and their interaction with other segments of the communities where they ended up living have also remained unexplored. In all my years, I have heard white folks, particularly white Cubans, write about and discuss the obvious divide that separates our races. Well-intentioned and often well-educated intellectuals study the subject with professional detachment from afar and draw their conclusions based on careful analysis and well-thought-out statistical formulas. The man on the street is often less informed and tends to either ignore the racial chasm or pretend it doesn't exist. Some would assert that yes, there is some degree of racial prejudice and discrimination in our history and our present, but that it is a much milder form of racism, sort of like a tropical, less destructive version of injustice than that practiced in the United States. Some have tried to define Black Cubans' lives through their own filter view. Throughout our history, race relations in the Cuban diaspora have been defined in different ways and have always been a thorny issue to address head-on. I firmly believe that everyone is entitled to his opinion, but I also think that, to quote Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb in his skin and walk around in it. Few white people I know have walked in the skin of a Black man. All my life, I have proudly walked in that skin, and I want to tell my story. It's the story of a Black Pedro Pan. As mentioned earlier, very few Black Cubans left the island following the ascent of the revolution. There were many reasons for this. One, I'll just mention just two. One, the racial turmoil and injustices practiced in the United States was known in most Black Cuban circles, particularly on my father's side of the family. Although Cuban society was not bereft from its old racial tensions, the phrase, Más vale mal conocido que bueno por conocer. Translated, it means a known devil is better than an unknown angel. I had to ask my granddaughters to translate it because I really couldn't. Anyway, the concept was adopted by most Black Cubans. Secondly, the revolutionary government had promised to improve the lives of the Black inhabitants by bringing racial justice to the island, eliminate segregated schools, private beaches, clubs, etc. Be that as it may, the early migration of Cuban refugees to the U.S. was primarily made up by white or light-skinned Cubans, and the number of children sent to exile through Operation Pedro Pan reflected the racial makeup of the early migration. Throughout the course of the 3.5 years I spent in the program, I came in contact with a large number of these children, and I would venture to say that less than 1% of those I came across were Black, give or take a mulatto or two. It is safe to say that we were generally treated well by those in charge, all of them recently exiled Cubans. Although there are well-documented stories of children who were abused, neglected, mistreated, there is what I think is a myth that all Pedro Pans were successful. They all grew up to become Mel Martinez and Armando Codina. But my experience is different. A lot of my friends, a lot of my close friends, growing up in the places where we lived, ended up not well. Not because of anything that the program did, but because life gives us turns and twists that we must be able to maneuver. But that is a fact. I will also say that race was not a factor in the shelters where I was assigned to live. Although curiously, I was informed not too long ago by an unimpeachable source who sits in the audience tonight, that there were individuals in charge of the facilities where we were housed that would not accept Black children. It was not a big problem because there were very few Black children, so no big deal. During those 3.5 years, we were sheltered, fed, and clothed adequately, something for which I will be eternally grateful. We were educated mostly in Catholic schools, where we began the assimilation process critical for all immigrants. It was in these schools where I began to learn the intricacies of the English language and other subjects. But when studying algebra, geography, biology, etc., we were merely expanding our knowledge of a subject we had studied before, but we had never been exposed to U.S. history in all its glory. And for me, that narrative often contained elements I could not reconcile. The United States Constitution, I learned, was a well-thought-out document, and the folks who helped create the nation were men of enlightenment. They had, in fact, asserted that it was self-evident that all men are created equal. Yet, slavery, perhaps the cruelest form to demonstrate that not all men are created equal, was a legally accepted concept. But the book I always wanted to read and eventually wrote goes beyond my experience as a Pedro Pan. When my parents finally were able to leave the island, 4 years later, I was 17, I had to abandon the safety I had carved out for myself within the boundaries of the Catholic Welfare Bureau. Now 17 years old, in many ways, the man of the house, something difficult for my parents to accept, especially my alpha male father. I quickly learned that our reunion would be, in ways I had not imagined, a more difficult experience than our separation 3.5 years earlier. I will give you an example. Our first encounter with Cuba in Miami in 1966, this is when my parents arrived and I had to leave the Catholic Welfare Bureau and become a civilian, I guess. The first experience with Cuba in Miami was extremely unpleasant and awkward and left a deep imprint in my psyche and foreshadowed many similarly distasteful encounters I would experience with my compatriots later on in life. One of my parents' old friends from back home suggested that we rent an apartment in the building where she lived. She said there were several units available and offered to make arrangements with the building manager so we could rent one of the apartments. The building was located in Little Havana, which was ideal for my parents since they did not speak the English language and wanted to remain in a neighborhood where they could communicate in their native language. It was a rat and roach-infested old building inhabited by other recently arrived Cuban exiles for whom low rent payments were the most important consideration. When we were told that the deal had been arranged, we found our way to the apartment building to pay the deposit and get the keys to our new home. But when the building manager saw our faces, he refused to rent the apartment to us and unapologetically told us that blacks were not allowed to live in the building. The fact that the building manager was also a recently arrived Cuban refugee added salt to the wound. It was only after I forcefully argued that recently enacted laws prohibited discrimination in housing, demanded that he make available the unoccupied apartment and informed him that I was prepared to call the authorities if he insisted on discriminating against us, that he relented and reluctantly agreed to rent us an apartment in his crumbling building. In my writing, I mentioned several examples of what some people refer to as othering. The fact that for many Cubans, we were too black to be Cuban, as if no African or African descendant had ever set foot on our soil, on Cuban soil. Likewise, for many African Americans, we were too Cuban to be black, refusing to understand that the same ships that dropped their ancestors off in Virginia moved on and dropped ours off in the port of Havana. A rather awkward incident turned out to be an amusing example of this othering ambiguity. Not many years ago, and much to my annoyance, in Cuba, Miami back then, a black person who spoke Spanish or had a Spanish surname was usually identified as anything but Cuban. I'll tell you a story that's kind of funny, but it did happen. I have to find it first. Okay, I was no longer living in Miami, but for business or personal reasons, I flew to the city as often as possible. I had booked a room at a hotel I often patronize, and when I reached the front desk, I was greeted by a young clerk. After returning the greeting, I told him my name and gave him my credit card to complete the check-in process. The clerk was around 10 years younger than me and had a distinct Cuban accent. He curiously repeated my name and maintained the conversation in English by asking me where I was from. This question, annoying sometimes, is often asked of me when I speak Spanish and they're not expecting it. This particular time, I decided to email the clerk and asked him where he thought I was from. He thought for a moment and said, "Puerto Rican?" No, I said, Dominican? Nah. He asked, wrong again. And then he ran through 3 or 4 different nationalities, whatever. So finally I said, I told him I was from the same place he was from. He said, I don't think so, I'm Cuban. And I said, so am I. So the clerk, showing surprise, wondered if I was kidding him. I asked him what part of Cuba he was from, and he said he was from Havana. I said, me too. Now he thought I was toying with him. I asked him what part of Havana he was from, and to my surprise, he said, El Cotorro. I said, me too. Now he wanted to fight with me. The funny thing is that I had to mention certain landmarks and certain places in El Cotorro before he was convinced that I was from there. And it turned out that he was born and raised like 2 or 3 blocks from my house. In the book, I write about the relationship between different groups, the blacks and Cubans. We find ourselves being a part of both groups, and it is difficult sometimes. In the early years of the exile experience, that relationship was amiable, if not friendly, both groups being the target of a hostile white Miami. Over time, and for many different reasons, however, the relationship began to sour. I can't think of a better example of the growing rift that separated the two groups than the following episode. With a heavy heart, I followed the drama surrounding Nelson Mandela's visit to Miami shortly after his release from 27 long, hard years of captivity. The ugly confrontation again pierced the fragile truce that had long existed between the Black and the Cuban communities in Miami. In the end, the city, and Cubans in particular, took another blow to their images in the eyes of many, stuck their tongues out at the entire African diaspora by pouring salt in an open wound, and suffered irreplaceable economic damage due to the boycott that preceded the decision of our Cuban mayors of cities in the greater Miami who refused to welcome Nelson Mandela to our beautiful city. Fortunately, the Miami Herald reported years later that the dispute had eventually led to significant economic change, and that Mandela's visit to Miami Beach sparked boycott but caused change. I know well, and I am particularly pleased, that the two main antagonists in this tragic drama, both men of goodwill, have buried the hatchet and made peace with each other. But while it is reassuring to remember that time heals all wounds, it would also be wise to pay heed to the notion that although the wound may eventually heal, sometimes it becomes infected, or it may fester open for a long time. And even if it heals, it almost always leaves behind an ugly scar as a reminder. A more recent example of the rift between the Blacks and Cubans in Miami was the events that transpired after the George Floyd incident. And I believe that some comments made by the Black Lives Matter group were offensive to Cubans. And so anyway, there is a rift. I also write about my travels to the island. Over the years, I have made several trips to a place I still have dreams about. Most of my relatives are now gone, but I have made many new friendships and gotten to know very interesting people there. I have also gotten a better understanding of Cuban society as it has evolved since I left the island. I have found that despite the promises made in its infancy by the revolutionary government to bring racial equality to the nation, Black Cubans today find themselves at the bottom of society's totem pole. They live in the most marginalized neighborhoods, suffer the highest rate of incarceration, are the most persecuted and incarcerated, are racially profiled, and have less representation in the spheres of power. That, despite that, according to many, Afro-descendants constitute most of the population. It is no wonder that most dissident organizations are headed by Black Cubans. I am an optimist by nature, and given the recent events that have taken place in the island, I am hopeful that sooner rather than later, a better tomorrow is in store for my long-suffering homeland. Many things have changed since I became a Pedro Pan. It is comforting to know that some positive changes have taken place since I became aware of race. In the US, I no longer have to sit in the back of a public bus, nor am I forced to use an inferior public facility. I can eat at any famous and not so famous restaurant and walk in through the front door. Heck, I can even be president. Well, not really, because I was born abroad, but you get. In the country of my birth, there are no racially segregated beaches, no racially segregated clubs, no racially segregated schools any longer. These changes are definitely encouraging, but a vast educational and wealth gap fueled by 400 years of subjugation, segregation, exclusion, suppression, and racial injustice separates blacks and whites in both the US and in Cuba. In the US, we still long for a day when we live in a nation where my children and grandchildren, children and grandchildren of all colors and nationalities, will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, as Dr. Martin Luther King once said. Blacks in the island of my memories, after providing the blood during Cuba's War of Independence from Spain, followed by more than half a century of indifferent neglect in a racist society, and another 60 years taking the brunt of the damage inflicted on its people by an incompetent, ineffective government, remain mired in a persistent struggle for racial justice. What else must we do to gain our rightful share? I have lived the life I wanted, have a wonderful, loving family, a tight circle of loyal and trusted friends, many of them also Pedro Pans, had a successful and fulfilling professional career, and I'm now comfortably retired. I come from very, very humble origins. If someone would have told me when I was 12 years old that I would live the life I have lived, I would have advised them to seek psychiatric help. I would be ungrateful if I did not recognize that much of my good fortune is owed to the Pedro Pan program and to the many opportunities that this country has made available to me. Not everyone is as fortunate. But I would be equally disingenuous, dishonest, I think, if I didn't point out that a wide socio-economic gap driven by racism, injustice, and exclusion still separates blacks and whites in the US and in Cuba. James Baldwin, another of my favorite writers, once said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Slavery, the original sin of my place of birth, out of my adopted country, has left a legacy that must be acknowledged, confronted, and repaired. I will close with this. My life is well established in the United States. It has been my home for more than 90% of my life, but I still have a deep connection to the land of my roots. I do not pretend to speak for all Black Cubans, but I can say with confidence that over the years, I have met and spoken with many Black Cuban exiles in Miami and other places throughout the country, in Cuba, anywhere, and they almost universally share the sentiments I have tried to convey in this narrative. I've also met several Black Cubans in the island who are well aware of a racial history and have a clear vision of the difficult path on the road to racial justice. It is encouraging to see Black Cubans leading or at the forefront of several different organizations that have sprung up over the years. It is my hope that when change finally comes to the island, the new rejuvenated nation can fulfill Martí's dream of a sovereign nation, con todos y para el bien de todos. Patria y vida. You're going to make me blush. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question regarding a comment you made about your parents sending you over and that they knew about the racial issues that we had in this country. So what made them decide anyway to send you over?
I've asked myself that question many years, but I guess it's the same thing that that made Carmen's parents decide, the fear of communism. There was a rumor that boys were going to be inducted into the military at age 14 and sent to Russia. You know, there were a lot of factors, but you know, my father was always reluctant because my father was not American friendly. So he was very reluctant at first, but my mother, you know, women always went out and things like that. I don't get it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hola, Ricardo.
Hola.
Chacua, how are you?
Good.
I bought your book when it first came out, which was a while back.
Yes.
And I found it very interesting. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
And I took some notes. And there's just one question now that I would like to ask you. You mentioned, I think when you were a teenager, you worked as a coach for a group of students, some athlete students.
Not in the book, I didn't mention that.
Okay, let me finish the story. Maybe you'll.
Okay.
I read it. Well.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you were paid $22 a week.
No, I was coaching. I was
Coaching, yeah.
No coaching, refereeing.
Well, I'm not an athlete, so I mix the terms. So you were a referee for a group of students?
No, I was refereeing for the Big Five.
That's what I wanted to ask you.
Yes.
Because you said that the arrangement was that they were going to pay you $22
Right.
every week. So for about 3 weeks, you went after the end of the week.
No.
Okay, good. So tell us.
It was simpler than that. A friend of a very famous person in Miami, I won't mention his name.
Why?
No.
That's one of my things. Why don't you mention more names?
My objective is not to insult anyone or to pass judgment on anyone. I just try to convey a general sense
point.
of how things are. So mentioning names doesn't add any value to it. But anyway, asked me if I would help him coach.
Right.
Referee games at the Big Five. I had an incident at the Big Five years earlier, so I wasn't crazy about it.
You mentioned that here.
I mentioned the incident in the
Yes.
book, and I'm going to mention it because the individuals that it happened with are sitting here today.
Okay.
I had a lot of from camp, from where we lived.
Yes.
We made very close relationships that were extended after we left the place. So, I don't know, three or 4 years after we left the place, we became civilians, he decided to get married, or more years, I don't know, I don't remember how many years. And the wedding was at the Big Five. So I went to the wedding along with other black people from the camps who also happened to be here. We went to the thing like nothing ever happened. Much later, my friend tells me that it had been a big brouhaha in his family, at her family, because they didn't want to invite any black people to the Big Five. And that, you know, he basically said, if my friends don't go, I don't get married. So when he told me that, I always was predisposed to not be very happy to work at the Big Five. So I went to work at the Big Five. The deal was that there were games, intramural games, Saturday and Sunday, and I would make $22 a weekend. And $22 in them days was serious money. But I had to drive to Westchester, whatever. So after the final game, I went to get paid, and he told me, oh, I don't have the money right now, my check, whatever. Come back next week. So the following week I go back. I drive all the way to Westchester, and I get there, and I go to the guy's office. And the guy in my face, he told me he was not going to pay me. This is the Big Five, where all the, ultra fancy, whatever people, and this guy is trying to cheat me out of $22. So when I was younger, I had a real bad temper. Some of my friends can attest to that. I wanted to kill the guy. But I was so angry that I said, you know what? If you need the money more than I do, keep it. And I walked out. But I'll never forget that. I was like, wow, $22. Yeah.
So the reason I'm bringing this up is because you never mentioned the name Big Five in the book. I said 5 big clubs. Or something like that.
I said, five big clubs.
Well,
I don't want to insult the Big Five because I'm sure they've changed their policies over the years. Well, I'm not sure, but I assume they have changed their policies over the years.
So I just wanted to know which was the club, so it was the Big Five.
It was the Big Five, yes. But, I cannot say
Thank you.
I cannot say it. I keep saying, the 5 major clubs in Havana,
Anybody else? Any other questions? Oh, Elena?
It's traffic.
Hi, Ricardo.
Hi.
I haven't met you personally, but we have texted each other and talked. I talked to you.
Did I say anything incorrectly?
No. Actually, it was Father Alberto Garcia, that recommended the book.
I know who you are now.
And I read it. I'm very hesitant to buy any book, but at his recommendation, I bought it, and I read it. I just couldn't close it. I didn't read it all in once, but almost. But what I want to say is this. Yes, you are a Black Pedro Pan, and I'm not Black, so I don't know that part of the experience. But reading your book, what I realized is that we have lived through the same thing. Your separation from your family, your arriving here, the emotions are exactly the same. You are a Pedro Pan.
Yeah.
Quick question. Thank you first for being here. I haven't read your book. I'll get to it.
Shame on you.
Yes. Just a quick question. Where, if you have, and I'm sure you have, felt more rejected for being Black, here or in Cuba?
Wow. In Cuba now or in Cuba?
Well, in Cuba where you were there, and here maybe your first years.
It is difficult to compare because, first of all, the numbers in Cuba are overwhelmingly, at least in the places that I went to, blacks, if they're not the majority, they're very close to it.
Oh, nowadays, but not when you left.
Oh, when I left? No, when
Yeah,
I left,
I meant when you were there.
No, when I was left, I wasn't really, I was aware of race, but I wasn't really, I was 13 years old, and my family, on my mother's side of the family, is multicolored. So I wasn't really particularly aware of it, no.
So you cannot compare. I see.
I can't compare.
I see. Thank you.
But even if I could, and one was better than the other, if you had a gun with 6 bullets in it and shot me only 3 times, should I be grateful?
Of course not. Thank you.
You're welcome. Here comes trouble.
No, the first thing is a lady read the book because of the recommendation of Father Garcia. I will not follow any recommendation from Father Garcia at all. You support me, eh? Chagua, I'm going to call you Chagua this time. Because I only called you Ricardo when I was mad with you. And he knows that. When I called him Ricardo, he was in trouble. Nobody knows that Ricardo was a basketball player, very successful basketball player. He's in Belen Sport Hall of Fame, and he also was the first athlete from the Belen over here in Miami that received a scholarship for basketball. So he's a leader among us. The Belen graduated. I am graduated from Belen, and I think there is a bunch of guys over here. Not you, Garcia, you are from La Salle. But there is a lot over here from Belen. And Chaco was a leader among the students of Belen. I don't know if he was black or white. I think I found his black today, all right? Because for me, it was Chaco, and period. But Chaco, I want to ask you a question. You play basketball with the same team for 2 years. You were champions 2 years. 2 consecutive years, this team was champion. And there were 2 leaders on that team, one white and one black. And he knows who are rich. The white one already died. There were 2 leaders. At any time you felt like your teammates were more pro the white guy or were more pro you?
No, never.
Never.
But I was better.
I hate to admit this one. This is the best athlete I ever coached in my life.
Here comes the other trouble.
On that note, it's not really a question, it's a testimonial. Okay, Ricardo was my first chief of staff as county commissioner, and by far, he was the best chief of staff I've ever had. I could tell you a few anecdotes and stories, but I'd rather you buy my book when I talk about it.
Wow, that's it. Great.
Ven para aquí.
Yes, sir.
Para que estés en luz.
Ricardo, es Mercedes.
Yeah, it's Mercedes.
Y ya que tenemos a Belen y La Salle,
Yeah.
we have Notre Dame Academy, and I'm sure we have a lot of other all Catholic. I appreciate the history, and I also identify as Afro-Cuban. I was raised in Miami. I've been in California for the last 35 years and now coming back, and I want to appreciate your welcome home with a history and reempaparme with my roots. I love the book, and I love your talk today with the stories, and my question to you is, what's the next phase And what's the legacy with your leadership that you want to leave on this conversation of what we can do next to alleviate the plight of the Black Cuban here in Miami, as well as those in our country?
I guess the best way I can answer that question is throughout these 60 years, Black Cubans have been basically invisible, both in Cuba and the United States. And it's funny, whenever I meet a Black Cuban, and I've met hundreds, if not thousands of them over the years, they always have the same comments, the same objections to being invisible, to being excluded. I don't know that the word excluded fits, because I don't know if it's a conscious, the fact is that we don't exist. So one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is that I didn't want anyone to tell our story. It's one man's opinion, but you can believe me when I tell you that it reflects a lot of, or the opinion of a lot of other people. So one of the goals that I had set for the book was to somehow try to serve as a catalyst to amplify the voices of Black Cubans, both in Cuba and in exile. And for example, we mentioned the Black Lives Matter incident with the Cuban community. Well, it is a conflict for us because we're Black and we're Cuban. I have children, I have grandchildren. So Black lives do matter to me. I'll tell you a little story that maybe conveys what I'm trying to say. My oldest daughter, who's also here tonight, a few years ago confided in me that when she was pregnant, she prayed every night so that she wouldn't have boys, because she didn't want to have to raise boys and worry every night where they went and what time they get home. And so from that standpoint, I have to support Black Lives Matter. It's self-preservation. But the comments that they made were, I thought, uninformed. But we can coexist in both worlds. We can be as black is black, and as Cuban is Cuban. And I hope to convey that in the book. Yes, sir? Does that answer your... Oh, my God.
The first thing I want to say is that I don't want to hear any more comments about me, right? Especially from that little thing over there. No, I just want to say that I am very proud to be your friend.
Likewise.
Perdón. Yo creo que yo te conozco a ti hace toda mi vida. Ahora estaba hablando ahí con Mariana cuando estaba haciendo el comentario. Yo lloro por cualquier cosa, ¿ok? Tú has sido siempre mi hermano, mi amigo, y no sé más qué se puede ser entre dos personas que se criaron juntos y que nunca, y se lo dije ahora a Mariana, coño, yo nunca vi a Chagua como black, ni yo como white.
You're colorblind, right?
Tú sabes, yeah?
You're colorblind.
Yeah, I am. Tú sabes, porque I'll see you with my heart. I don't see you with my eyes. And I never realized many things until I read it in your book.
Really?
Yes. For me, Luisa made the best, Luisa was his mother, the best arroz con pollo in the world. She once called me in dinner, you know, Valdez, you are a tártaro. I don't know if you know what a tártaro means. And she was a great woman, your dad was a great man, and you are the best friend any man can have.
Wow.
Jacqua. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you. You all are going to make me blush after all.
I am going to be real short. You know that you and me, and what can I say? I don't have a brother or sister. I know you don't have a brother or sister. But you know that I had the best brother ever, and I love you. That's all I have to say.
Wow.
You're my brother.
Ooh, wow.
And I have never seen you as black or white. You're my brother. And we went to Cuba together with his granddaughter. And it was the best experience that I had in my life. I'm here for you. And I'm colorblind. I love you.
Wow.
I have a question. I'm a Pedro Pan, but not from Florida City. So, can I make a question? When you made your book, I was one of the first that ordered it through Amazon.
Thank you.
So, and I read it and I enjoyed it. It was very easy to read. My English is not very good, so. But I love the way it's written. I learned many things. And I'm happy that you wrote it. So we can see the experience from your eyes, which is a different perspective than most of us have. I just want to ask you a question. In the epilogue, I think you read it, you say that you're happy to know that in the United States you can eat in a restaurant, this and that, and in your own country, you're happy that it's not segregated beaches or clubs. And I wanted to ask you, because I think the beaches and the clubs and the hotels are segregated for black and for white people. Only tourists can be there. So I wanted to make that point, if you thought about that.
If you want to be technical about it, you're correct. Yeah, I meant black and white, but you're correct.
Yeah, because that struck me as, okay, but I know that the tourists can go, but not or the people with dollars, but not the normal people, either white or black. So.
It goes beyond that. It goes beyond way beyond black and white. One of my cousins is a fairly prominent doctor in Cuba, and one of my trips we went to, I wanted to see Varadero because it was supposed to be the best beach in the world. And when we got there, there was like a bar, bistro kind of thing, and I just walked in, and when he was going to walk, they stopped him. You know, I was like, what? First of all, how do they know that I am a tourist? And he's not. And he's a big doctor. He was what do they call the Seremos como el Che, pionero and all that stuff. And he served in the military, and I'm a gusano from Hialeah, you know. And I could go, but so it goes beyond. It's beyond the nationality, color. It's just weird. It's a mess. The place is a mess. Patria y vida.
Thank you. And you are a Pedro Pan,
yeah.
And there's no color. What I see here is love for all your Pedro Pan brothers and sisters. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Here?
Yeah, we can do it there. Okay. Yeah. So if anybody has a book, we can make a line. And, Graciela is first.